All right, we're back in the saddle here, and we're going to start pushing our way alongside the Canadian Pacific here. Just a quick note about today. It is a Sunday morning. I picked this on purpose because generally Sundays tend to be a little quieter on the Canadian Pacific, and as you're going to see up ahead when we get even closer to the Canadian Pacific line, I don't really sort of fancy being that close to the Canadian Pacific as we kind of hug the shore with you know, a full train kind of roaring by. Anyway, you can kind of see here as we pull up, you can kind of see the view. I don't kill myself here in the ballast. So again, you can see the Nipigon River, just absolutely gorgeous view. You can see kind of what's going on this morning. It's 18 degrees Celsius and it's 90% humidity. We're supposed to get some showers this afternoon. It is just absolutely gross. I don't do well with humidity. Here's another good view here. You can see all the cliffs. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous area, and it's actually kind of good that it's cloudy because otherwise you'd never see that. We'd be shooting right into the sun here. I don't do well with humidity, so I am just dripping in sweat here. There's a little bit of breeze. You can see there's just the slightest ripple coming off the river here, so it's helping a little bit, but I am quite perspired already. It's not even 10 o'clock. It's just under 10 o'clock in the morning. So here you can see the how close we are again to the river. You'll notice that there's a bit of erosion here, and you're going to see farther to the south as we get closer to Red Rock some of the measures that they took to try to reinforce the grade here, because as we get further south, the river opens up into a bay, and obviously the water moves a lot more significantly than it would here, and I'm sure erosion was a big issue. So maybe it's at this point that we should do our usual history lesson. So this line was built by Canadian Northern Railway between 1911 and 1914. This was going to be one of the last pieces in Canadian Northern Railway's transcontinental line. So back around the turn of the century, so starting in 1899, Canadian Northern began building, as one of their first construction projects, they began building a line west from the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, to Winnipeg, and that line was completed and opened in 1902. Then Canadian Northern began building all kinds of lines into the prairies and across the prairies. And then shortly thereafter, they started building north from Toronto. They acquired a number of sort of inactive charters. Here you can see some of the signaling on the Canadian Pacific. The Kinghorn was not signaled. It's dark territory, but you're going to see that there is a little bit of a thing with that as we get closer to Red Rock. So as I was saying, they built north from Toronto. See some more of the view here, and you can see some of the rock work on the Canadian Pacific. So the Canadian Pacific was built through here 1884, 1885. It was actually one of the last pieces of the Canadian Pacific to be built, because again, the construction was very difficult. So they began building north from Toronto and eventually reached the Sudbury area. And it was at that point that Canadian Northern realized that in order to make their railway line viable, they would have to build a transcontinental line. You can see the milepost marker on the Canadian Pacific, so 66, milepost 66. Here you can see the just absolutely gorgeous view. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting myself here, but it's this is just one of the most beautiful stretches of the line. So Canadian Northern realized that they would have to build a transcontinental line. Now the problem is that they didn't actually want to build the section between Sudbury, specifically Ruel, and Port Arthur, because it was very long. It was over 500 miles, and the construction was going to be extremely difficult. And one of the issues was actually this area right here. So Canadian Northern actually tried to get a running rights agreement with Canadian Pacific from Port Arthur to Nipigon, so through this area here, because again, this was going to be one of the more difficult sections to build. And again, I'm going to be explaining that a little bit more in a second. Now, unfortunately, they could not come to an agreement on that. And so Canadian Northern was forced to build. And so again, the construction began in 1911, and the line was completed in 1914. So New Year's Day 1914, the last spike was driven. Now here, again, I'm interrupting myself, so a couple things. You can see a base of one of the telegraph poles. And here you can actually see this very, very red colored rock. And so this is the rock that gives the next community, Red Rock, its name. The whole geological explanation for this is these rocks belong to a geological formation called the Sibley group. And that kind of permeates the line all the way down to a place called Pass Lake. And we've been to Pass Lake before, and I'll flash some links to some videos up there, and I'll put them in the description as well. And so basically there's a high iron content in the rock, and that's why it gives it that sort of that red tinged color. Anyway, going back to our story. So Canadian Northern tried to get a running rights agreement, couldn't do that. They had to build the line. Now, one of the most difficult areas of construction was right through this area, and the reason for that was there wasn't a really good route between Red Rock and Nipigon. And one of the things Canadian Northern didn't want to do is they did not want to cross the Canadian Pacific line. And so between here and Nipigon, what they had to do was, unless they wanted to blast through a whole heck of a ton of rock, you can see these ridges here, they actually had to build outboard of the Canadian Pacific. And so you can see that arrangement right here, and you're going to see it more as we head to the south. So basically the Canadian Pacific hugged the shoreline here of the Nipigon River, and the Canadian Northern was going to have to build outboard of that. And that presented a huge amount of engineering challenges. Essentially the grade here, and you're going to start seeing that right here, is all fill. It's all rock fill that was basically dumped into the lake, because essentially the Canadian Pacific line here was the shoreline, and so they had to build another shoreline to facilitate the grade. And again, you can kind of see that here, all the rock fill. And again, you're going to see that further down, what they had to do to sort of shore up some of the spots on the grade here, because it was in some cases being eroded by wave action. So this is all rock fill that was dumped in to create this. And so you can imagine the engineering and the cost that was involved in this. This line was ridiculously expensive to construct. Estimates put what it would cost to build in today's dollars at $500 million. And so really almost $1 million a mile this line would have cost to construct today. So just a huge amount of money. Now, unfortunately, the construction cost of this line, coupled with construction in other areas, particularly the mountains of British Columbia, had some really significant financial impacts on Canadian Northern Railway. And so only a few years after this line opened, so the line opened in 1915, the company was in serious financial trouble. They were not able to pay their bills. Again, you can see some bases of the telegraph poles here. And so eventually they had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And then in 1918, the Canadian government decided to merge, amalgamate, whatever word that you want to use to describe that, the Canadian Northern with a bunch of other government-owned bankrupt lines called the Canadian Government Railways. And that merger formed Canadian National Railways. And so that company was born. And that merger, that process was finally finished in 1923 with the absorption of the Grand Trunk lines. And so the name of this line changed from the Nipigon subdivision of Canadian Northern Railway to the Dorion subdivision of Canadian National Railways. And it remained as such until 1960, when the Dorion subdivision was merged with the more easterly Kinghorn subdivision, and the whole line became the Kinghorn. And that carried on until 2005, when Canadian National decided to discontinue operations on this line. And starting in 2008, they began ripping up the rails, and that process was completed by 2010. Okay, so we've kind of arrived at the end of sort of this section here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start sort of plugging along, and what's going to happen is the distance here between the grades here is going to narrow, and we're going to get closer and closer to the lake.